Book the Second, Chapter 7 of Armadale. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Darvinia. Armadale by Wilkie Collins, Chapter 7. The plot thickens. 2 messages were waiting for Allan when he returned to the house. One had been left by Midwinter. He had gone out for a long walk, and Mr. Armadale was not to be alarmed if he did not get back till late in the day. The other message had been left by a person from Mr. Pedgift's office, who had called, according to appointment, while the 2 gentlemen were away at the major's. Mr. Bashwood's respects, and he would have the honor of waiting on Mr. Armadale again in the course of the evening. Toward 5 o'clock Midwinter returned, pale and silent. Allan hastened to assure him that his peace was made at the cottage, and then, to change the subject, mentioned Mr. Bashwood's message. Midwinter's mind was so preoccupied, or so languid, that he hardly seemed to remember the name. Allan was obliged to remind him that Bashwood was the elderly clerk, whom Mr. Pedgift had sent to be his instructor in the duties of the steward's office. He listened without making any remark, and withdrew to his room, to rest till dinner time. Left by himself, Allan went into the library, to try if he could while away the time over a book. He took many volumes off the shelves, and put a few of them back again, and there he ended. Miss Milroy contrived in some mysterious manner to get in this case between the reader and the books. Her formal bow and her merciless parting speech dwelt, try how he might to forget them, on Allan's mind. He began to grow more and more anxious as the idle hour wore on, to recover his lost place in her favor. To call again that day at the cottage, and ask if he had been so unfortunate as to offend her, was impossible. To put the question in writing with the needful nicety of expression proved, on trying the experiment, to be a task beyond his literary reach. After a turn or 2 up and down the room, with his pen in his mouth, he decided on the more diplomatic course, which happened in this case to be the easiest course too, of writing to Miss Milroy as cordially as if nothing had happened, and of testing his position in her good graces by the answer that she sent him back. An invitation of some kind, including her father of course, but addressed directly to herself, was plainly the right thing to oblige her to send a written reply. But here the difficulty occurred of what the invitation was to be. A ball was not to be thought of, in his present position with the resident gentry. A dinner party, with no indispensable elderly lady on the premises to receive Miss Milroy, except Mrs. Gripper, who could only receive her in the kitchen, was equally out of the question. What was the invitation to be? Never backward when he wanted help, in asking for it right and left in every available direction, Allan, feeling himself at the end of his own resources, coolly rang the bell, and astonished the servant who answered it by inquiring how the late family at Thorpe Ambrose used to amuse themselves, and what sort of invitations they were in the habit of sending to their friends. "The family did what the rest of the gentry did, sir," said the man, staring at his master in utter bewilderment. "They gave dinner parties and balls; and in fine summer weather, sir, like this, they sometimes had lawn parties and picnics." "That'll do!" shouted Allan. "A picnic's just the thing to please her. Richard, you're an invaluable man. You may go downstairs again." Richard retired wondering, and Richard's master seized his ready pen. "Dear Miss Milroy, since I left you it has suddenly struck me that we might have a picnic. A little change and amusement, what I should call a good shaking up, if I wasn't writing to a young lady, is just the thing for you, after being so long indoors lately in Mrs. Milroy's room. A picnic is a change, and, when the wine is good, amusement too. Will you ask the Major if he will consent to the picnic, and come? And if you've got any friends in the neighborhood who like a picnic, pray ask them too, for I have got none. It shall be your picnic, but I will provide everything, and take everybody. You shall choose the day, and we will picnic where you like. I have set my heart on this picnic. Believe me ever yours, Allan Armadale. On reading over his composition before sealing it up, Allan frankly acknowledged to himself, this time, that it was not quite faultless. "Picnic comes in a little too often," he said. "Never mind. If she likes the idea, she won't quarrel with that." He sent off the letter on the spot, with strict instructions to the messenger to wait for a reply. In half an hour the answer came back on scented paper, without an erasure anywhere, fragrant to smell and beautiful to see. The presentation of the naked truth is one of those exhibitions from which the native delicacy of the female mind seems instinctively to revolt. Never were the tables turned more completely than they were now turned on Allan by his fair correspondent. Machiavelli himself would never have suspected, from Miss Milroy's letter, how heartily she had repented her petulance to the young squire as soon as his back was turned, and how extravagantly delighted she was when his invitation was placed in her hands. Her letter was the composition of a model young lady whose emotions are all kept under parental lock and key, and served out for her judiciously as occasion may require. "Papa" appeared quite as frequently in Miss Milroy's reply as "picnic" had appeared in Allan's invitation. Papa had been as considerately kind as Mr. Armadale in wishing to procure her a little change and amusement, and had offered to forego his usual quiet habits and join the picnic. With papa's sanction, therefore, she accepted with much pleasure Mr. Armadale's proposal, and at papa's suggestion she would presume on Mr. Armadale's kindness to add 2 friends of theirs recently settled at Thorpe Ambrose to the picnic party, a widow lady and her son, the latter in holy orders and in delicate health. If Tuesday next would suit Mr. Armadale, Tuesday next would suit papa, being the first day he could spare from repairs which were required by his clock. The rest, by papa's advice, she would beg to leave entirely in Mr. Armadale's hands, and in the meantime she would remain, with papa's compliments, Mr. Armadale's truly Eleanor Milroy. Who would ever have supposed that the writer of that letter had jumped for joy when Allan's invitation arrived? Who would ever have suspected that there was an entry already in Miss Milroy's diary, under that day's date, to this effect: "The sweetest, dearest letter from I know who. I'll never behave unkindly to him again as long as I live." As for Allan, he was charmed with the sweet success of his manoeuvre. Miss Milroy had accepted his invitation. Consequently, Miss Milroy was not offended with him. It was on the tip of his tongue to mention the correspondence to his friend when they met at dinner, but there was something in Midwinter's face and manner, even plain enough for Allan to see, which warned him to wait a little before he said anything to revive the painful subject of their visit to the cottage. By common consent they both avoided all topics connected with Thorpe Ambrose, not even the visit from Mr. Bashwood, which was to come with the evening, being referred to by either of them. All through the dinner they drifted further and further back into the old endless talk of past times about ships and sailing. When the butler withdrew from his attendance at table, he came downstairs with a nautical problem on his mind, and asked his fellow servants if they any of them knew the relative merits, on a wind and off a wind, of a schooner and a brig. The 2 young men had sat longer at table than usual that day. When they went out into the garden with their cigars, the summer twilight fell grey and dim on lawn and flower bed, and narrowed round them by slow degrees the softly fading circle of the distant view. The dew was heavy, and after a few minutes in the garden they agreed to go back to the drier ground on the drive in front of the house. They were close to the turning which led into the shrubbery, when there suddenly glided out on them, from behind the foliage, a softly stepping black figure, a shadow moving darkly through the dim evening light. Midwinter started back at the sight of it, and even the less finely strung nerves of his friend were shaken for the moment. "Who the devil are you?" cried Allan. The figure bared its head in the grey light, and came slowly a step nearer. Midwinter advanced a step on his side, and looked closer. It was the man of the timid manners and the mourning garments, of whom he had asked the way to Thorpe Ambrose, where the 3 roads met.